If you're going to show the truth of what that continent is, the music, the culture, and everything, then people on the outside don't have time to read a 500-page book or whatever to see.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but they're going to switch on the TV and they're going to watch a drama and they're going to go like, oh, so that's how we think India is from the Indian movies. That's how Indians think we are from the African movies.
From Cairo to Cape Town, Lagos to Lamu, 54 nations, one continent, countless perspectives. Hi, I'm Waweru Njoroge. Welcome to Panel 54, a global perspective through an African lens. This is the podcast where we unpack power, policy, people, and the paradoxes that define our time. With nuance, with history, and with a deliberate commitment to context. This isn't punditry, it's perspective. It's not a briefing, it's a reframing, and it starts right here. Today's conversation sits at an intersection we don't always name properly: culture. Not as entertainment, not as expression alone, but as infrastructure, as influence, as diplomacy. Some of the most powerful countries in the world did not just build economies, they built narratives, they exported identity, they shaped what the rest of the world sees as normal, desirable, and possible. That influence travels quietly through film, television, language, character, and story. According to UNESCO, as of 2022, the global cultural and creative industries generated over $2.5 trillion annually and employed nearly 30 million people worldwide. So the question for Africa is not whether we are visible. We actually are. The question is whether that visibility translates into power, into ownership, into leverage. There is a difference between being seen and being understood, and an even bigger difference between being understood and being in control of the story. To help us unpack that, I'm joined by two cultural practitioners whose work sits at the intersection of craft and consequence, Mkamzee Mwatela and Jinna Mutune. At its core, this conversation turns on how stories travel, who shapes them, and what happens once they land. Mkamzee, Jinna, thank you so much for joining us on Panel 54.
Thank you.
Now, before we get into the systems and strategy, I want to start with you guys, right? Because behind every cultural system are individuals making choices about what their stories are and why. So, Mkamzee, I'll start with you. What is the moment or series of moments, actually, that made your storytelling feel less like an interest and more like a calling?
I was joking about it earlier when we were saying when I was 4, but truly when I was 4. So when I was 5 years old, I went to watch my first musical in St. Mary's, and they would do this really grand musicals, and you would sit right at the orchestra pit, and you would be like, toe-to-toe with the orchestra. And of course, I hadn't ever seen anything live. And so I think for that moment, that was the first moment where it was a thing, like a live show, this understanding that there were people doing something, which I was there to watch. And of course, coming from cartoons and seeing something on screen, it was very, I don't know, it just like stuck with me, and I never lost it because musicals became a huge part of my life. But then I think that even when I went through high school, going through primary school, performance was, we do drama festivals. But for me, that was never performance because that was stuck in my head. The orchestra, the grand thing, the crazy things happening on stage. And every career moment has happened. It's been providential. I've never aimed for it,
right? Which
has been a very interesting thing. So I didn't think I was going to be in any way in the acting profession or in film or theater. It was, in fact, I studied music largely, and I thought I was going to be a musician.
Right.
And my first audition was to go and be in a musical because I wanted to sing. And then that was, audition for this role. So everything has been providential. So I think the first time it really stuck that it could be a thing was when we were doing that particular musical, which was, years ago. But we were doing that musical and we were all having a fine time. We went through the entire rehearsal period. Unbeknownst to us, the people who were the production house that was running the musical had invited the writer and the original. It was Sarafina. It was the original, the writer and the star of Sarafina. They'd been invited to the premiere. So they came in and we were like, it's like a big deal, and then we did the musical and they were there and they're like, oh, so they started asking questions about like our rehearsal and, you know, and she was talking about, oh, you should come and we should do this. And that's the first time I was like, oh, this could be a career.
Okay.
Yeah.
Jinna, what did that moment look like for you?
Oh, well, I think one of the very vivid memories I have is we had a black and white TV. And I wasn't so good. I kind of delayed in my speech. But my mom remembers me trying to tell her to get me a Golden Moor box. It was a cereal.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do remember vividly looking at the cereal, how it was pouring on the bowl, the lighting around it. I remember thinking, how brilliant is this? But I didn't think, I was going to be a filmmaker because there was no language for that. But I remember because I couldn't say golden box. There's a way I was saying it. My mom just says I kept pointing at the TV every time it came. She understood that's what I wanted and she got me. So I was the kid who had a bit of cereals when the other kids didn't. But my vivid memory of that was, it was what do you call it? Like a culmination of many little moments that made me know, oh, this is actually what you need to do. I was the kid who directed Kalongo, Playhouse.
Okay.
I was like, it's not interesting. Let me be the villain. Let me chase you. Then we would watch Camp Cucamonga and then we would be like, oh yeah, tomorrow, we're all meeting at this house that has so many trees. You all carry your clothes so we can change clothes, Yeah, so I was just like, what? Every time I touched drama or I touched anything to do with entertainment, I would find myself flourishing. All I remember every time I would enter that space, if I touched that thing, I would feel more alive than when I was outside it. So that's the feeling I remember.
To both of you, what kind of tensions do you constantly have to face when you're working with your creative work day to day now? What are the constant tensions? Money. I like that.
Always money.
Always money.
I think, and one that's interesting. Oh, so the other thing that has been a constant is also rigor. I think I've always been a very detail-oriented person. Mm-hmm. So I'm very I'm very nitpicky. But I think time as a result, because once especially you step into arenas like television, time is there's very little time. It's like this thing is needed, the turnover time is not the same. You can't say I'm working on this thing for 7 years.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It's like, well, you need to do it. And so even as a writer, especially as a writer and a director, time, it's like a constant thing. Like how much time do you give to the thing? But also knowing you have to fulfill delivery, deadline, so it's that constant tension between giving something the time that you think it needs to grow and develop, but at the same time understanding that it needs to be out there.
Okay.
Yeah.
I want to shift gears now to aspects of culture and power. So we know this. I mean, I think it's a given. Long before countries actually negotiate power, they are already perceived. Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
100.
And culture is what happens with that actual perception. So I'll start with you, Jinna. When we talk about film, television, theater, performance, what role do they actually play in shaping how the world understands Kenya and Africa as a broader spectrum?
Everything.
Yeah.
There's a saying that says, as film goes, so does art go.
Okay.
And if you really want to see the truth of this, if you think about how Hollywood started shaping how we were interacting with the different continents, you know what I'm saying? If you think first they started with the silent movies and they were showing us this grandness of what America was or what the Western nations were, and then now they switched gears at some point. Then they were like, oh, we've eaten so much of that. What's another interesting thing? Then they switched to the Godfathers. This was now the Italian culture coming up, right? And then at some point they switched and, they went into Kung Fu movies. Do you remember? Right? I do remember the guy coming to our school and trying to talk Kung Fu, explain the movie.
Right.
It was now playing like a silent movie, but anyway, before I go on a bunny trail. But then, so now there were the Kung Fu movies. And then now after, all the Asian movies, which are now driven by the Kung Fu culture, fried rice, all that. And then now I think there are, which I do believe capitalism is a consumer market that consumes culture. So now they're looking at what's next. And here is Africa so divided. and here's Africa not packaged well to be received.
The world
So they
understands
play
me.
everything, because whatever we package, if you're going to show the truth of what that continent is, the music, the culture, and everything, then people on the outside don't have time to read a 500-page book or whatever to see.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but they're going to switch on the TV and they're going to watch a drama and they're going to go like, oh. So that's how we think India is from the Indian movies. That's how Indians think we are from the African movies. So it's everything. And it's very sad that we don't have governments that understand how powerful the tool of film is, or the tool of storytelling is, in terms of them engaging with markets, international markets, or engaging with international governance. So that's I think it's everything. And it must be given that if we're really going to evolve Africa forward.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'd like you to weigh in on that one.
Well, it's pretty much the same. And it's interesting because you use the word storytelling, which is what I was going to say as well.
Right.
It is storytelling. And I think, especially in Kenya, what's now happening is Kenyans are such natural storytellers. This is why we go online and then we take over the space, and everyone's, picking up
Tell
on
who.
and and our phrase, our phraseology is being picked up by other people, and people are like, what does that mean? I just didn't see Kenyans saying this thing. So we are storytellers. So you can see like people's perception of Kenya is what? Sherehe? Kenyans just like to party, because that's the story that's out there. So whether negative or positive, that's something we can tap into, because there's already proof. Sometimes I think even with film and television, when you're trying to make the case for it, people are kind of like so steeped in this Hollywood idea. And sometimes I tell people, I'm like, okay, well, look at what's happening online. That tells you there's a market for it. Yeah. It's more that we have to figure out how to tell it that way, or how to tell that story, or capture that feeling, rather than trying to curate it into this,
something neatly packaged
Hollywood
and say,
idea, or now K-drama idea, everything except who we are.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I think you can borrow from that, but I just want to say it lightly. When you want to see how powerful that is, look at Lion King. That was Masai Mara packaged. Till today, there is no Broadway play that sells out like Lion King. There are versions of it. There is the animation. There is merchandise that has been created about it. They beat us at our game. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it just, it's part. And now people have a perception. If I come to Kenya, this is what I'm going to experience in the Mara. And if you've interacted with anyone in the global world, they always are like, do you have animals? Why do they ask that? Because of Lion King.
Exactly.
Yes, because of what they saw. Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
You mentioned the United States.
Yeah.
And if you look at the way they work, actually, the United States has exported not just entertainment,
Absolutely.
but values and identity based on what their culture. So what do we study from that kind of model, right? What can we study from that kind of model in terms of then making it, internalizing it and saying, okay, fine. So what can we take of the best of what they've done in terms of how their culture has been seen and their values and identities, and then apply it now to us as an African continent?
I think we just tell stories that are true to us, because there's a uniqueness in the African culture that is different from the Western nation. There's a sense of, or what we call Ubuntu-ness, that because I exist, you are.
Yeah.
Those are some of the values that if you put in the story, people are able to go like, oh yeah, this is something great about us. We want to push this. Our culinary experiences are, of course, something that I think is quite elevated compared to bland foods. Those are things, if you package, that people look and go like, oh, I actually want to try pilau food. I want to try chapati because I saw how that actor ate it, and I think it's a nice thing. So I think I'm not for the idea of throwing the baby with the water. I'm like, there's something great to learn from all these K-dramas, Hollywood flicks, Nollywood. Let's learn, and then let's express them. Let's have the platform of reinventing what that looks like. Okay. And for that, I say, I cannot quite say that you're doing a Kenyan film. You must at least do an East African film. Okay. Because for film to be successful, or for TV to be successful, it's a game of numbers. People always go like, compare Kenya to Nigeria. And I say, you can't. Because Nigeria has 300 million people. Kenya has 50 million plus. I mean, that's a huge difference. And for me, it took me 8 years of marketing a film, traveling to those locations, 16 global cities, trying to tell them about the film for me to realize, my God, it's a game of numbers. Because one time, if you have a 2 minutes, I can tell you the story. I sat in an Emirates plane, and for some reason I sat at the back, which I don't like. But as I came out, this is when I had a eureka moment. When I was coming out, because I was amongst the last to come out, I remember looking at all the screens of this huge airplane, and all the screens were turned onto Bollywood films. And I remember there was just a handful that had turned to Hollywood films. As I came out, I was like, oh my God, no wonder even if they acquire my film in Emirates or whatever they are, they cannot pay me money that can make sense in terms of ROI, return of investment. Because it was not just Indians who were in that plane, because we took the plane from Dubai. It was this whole Asian identity that they had created that makes them say, we belong to Bollywood. So Bollywood is moving 1 billion people plus all the other, what do you call them, the Arab countries that are also belonging to Bollywood. And now what is a Kenyan movie moving?
Okay.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah,
So you're right. And Hollywood is moving. It's moving. Just the internal market, America is 300 million. It's 300 million people, and they have a now global appeal. Look at that. So you cannot say, I mean, K-pop drama is the same thing. It's moving the Korean culture, but the larger Asian culture. So you cannot, if there's any time that I would say this, and I say I am a Pan-Africanism, it is now. We cannot move certain products, certain services in our myopic identities. Like, that's who I am, and I cannot belong to a larger identity.
So two things. First of all, what do we deliberately refuse to copy from the cultures that we are seeing being exported? And then what's stopping us from becoming a United States of Africa in that context of saying we're looking at billion plus, population? I mean, why would we not then be able to say, come together and support this industry?
So, what do we refuse to copy? So just let me take a circuitous route to answer that question. One of the things about the Hollywood thing, and I think it's such a wonderful thing if there was more told about Hollywood history, because I think in terms of what we should emulate, the thing about the history of Hollywood also is that it's so much providence and coincidence. And we're trying to reverse engineer something that wasn't engineered in the first place. And even for them, it was kind of like, they kept running into providence because, and I think what we can learn is where they did go wrong, because the Hollywood we know now were not the originators of the movie world, right? So you have that whole story about how Thomas Edison had invented the thing, and then the Lumiere brothers from France invented the projection, and then you had these four, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, Warner Brothers, who came in and were just like, this is so cool. And they were they didn't know anything about films, just like, this is such a cool thing. And they wanted the whole idea of dreams, they wanted to make a life. And so they were like, we can go into this thing. So we'll take these little pictures and project them in halls, right? Which led to the Nickelodeon thing. But the thing about that is, when it started to take over and they started encouraging this idea of features which were coming from plays and saying, okay, create a movie out of them and all that stuff, the mistake that Edison made, because the bigger story for me has always been, and then where did Edison go? Because these were the people making the movies. These were the people who they had created this antitrust law, not antitrust laws, but they'd created a monopoly. And when these guys started to take over and they were making all the money, they then tried to say they couldn't do anything outside of certain things. And it was a combination of politics, of course, the idea of economy, but also the idea that there was also, certain religious groups who were like, oh, this is sinful. But the interesting thing about that, it was all about money. And so they said, no, let's shut it down. You can only make films this way. And the thing is, these other guys had already tapped into people like coming in droves to this place. And they're like, there's a world out there. There's a commercial enterprise. And they just completely refused to do it. And that's how the first of them ended up in Hollywood. Like, it was, they needed to make a film that was far enough away where the laws didn't affect that idea that they could make a film, because they had actually shut it down such that they couldn't do anything. And I think that's such an interesting lesson, because it's like, in that they actually that's how they cultivated their own demise, and it kind of was the same thing when you look at the movement from cable or TV and all these things to streaming. right? Trying so hard to hold on, ended up creating the problem because it was this whole thing of we're monopolizing cable, we're monopolizing how things work. And people came up with solutions to say, well, if I can't get in there and I can't do that, and there's an internet and there's a this, and we can do this. So I think that's what I think is an interesting thing to learn, is how to not do what these guys did, or how to do what the other guys who are like solution did. Because I think there's a thing, it's very easy to talk on and on about it, but it's like sometimes the frustration driving you to innovation is wonderful.
Yeah.
Like, okay, how do we get out of this system? So a lot of the time, what I always say is like, in terms of emulating, I'm like, maybe don't. Maybe that is the answer. Like, maybe don't emulate that particular thing that has now led to the demise of this thing, but maybe emulate what originally happened, right? Which I think always comes back to your audience. Like, never forget who you're making the thing for, because these guys couldn't have known, but they created this movement and they were like, we just know that there's something out there for these people.
Yeah.
And these other guys went against that. They said, like, the audience doesn't matter.
Okay.
So I think even with here, one of the biggest things is that lack of audience awareness. Like, I find sometimes that we get very caught up in our little silo of filmmakers, TV people. And I'm like, yeah, but what is the audience doing? They exist. They want something. There's a reason they made the DVD burner people rich. Yeah. Because they are aware of what exists.
I had a DVD guy. Unfortunately, he passed away, but you still had a number with DVD guy, kind of thing.
And these guys became really wealthy because, and I say this because there used to be this thing where when you go to pitch something to a station, they would tell you, Kenyans don't want that. It's too sophisticated. It's too this. And I'm like, but look, Kenyans are the same ones watching this other thing. Right. So why wouldn't they want this? Like, and I think that mentality of what is the audience telling you, right? Being very attuned, and it comes back to culture because, the way people say politics is downstream of culture, right? Yep. I always think culture is downstream of art, right? It's almost like there's something prophetic about artists where it's almost like you can sniff out where things are going, but that's because you're accustomed to watching behavior. And you're like, this is what people want, and then you give it to them.
Okay, you mentioned the word Hollywood, and we know Hollywood is a very powerful place in terms of what they've done in terms of their content. But there's also the ecosystem behind the way Hollywood has actually been set up, right? So if you're to be very honest, Jinna, I'm going to ask this question to you. If you're very honest about where Kenya is today, what are the actual missing pieces of that ecosystem, right, that prevent Africa's stories from scaling globally?
Everything.
I somehow knew she was going to say that. Everything.
I always say every time. Well, it's everything in a way because everything also is so young. You know what I'm saying? So it needs to be fortified. The policymakers need to be encouraged to make better policies. One of the problems we have that I have a lot and I struggle a lot is when you're trying to do public screening of your films, and this is where you meet the audience. We don't have enough spaces to meet them. Okay. Right? We just have probably 10 or 15 functional cinemas. Now, talk about selling your film there and getting back your return of investments. It is not possible. So we don't have that. Exhibition spaces are not there, or they need to be reinforced and built. In fact, it's so sad that a lot of those film spaces have been turned to churches. And I always say those churches actually need to open up those places as cinemas in the afternoon, family-friendly cinemas. They would make money to continue maintaining the church, So those things are needed. I mean, there's the whole idea of funding. Where the funding is coming from. I remember, 2016, we all traveled to South Africa. Some chosen, quote-unquote, great filmmakers were sent to go and negotiate, to represent the whole collaboration of tax rebates. It never happened. South Africa had a system in which their filmmakers can actually use tax rebates or that system to be able to fund their films. But Kenya does not have a co-production capability. And so we lost that opportunity. South Africa was open, but Kenya wasn't because of politics. So poor governance is affecting us. We need money. You need companies or, what do I call them? You need investors who are willing to take the risk on filmmakers or storytellers. And that helps them to be able to explore this filmmaking without the first pressure of like the first thing you do has to make money.
Yeah.
In fact, I was privileged to have such investors who ventured with me in my first film. And I remember one of them actually in the boardrooms telling me, Jinna, you might not succeed in this, but I believe in you and I have to do this for you. I thought, oh my God, are there more people like that who would believe? And it's because of them believing that I'm still doing this thing. Because I always say there's a village that has backed me and I cannot quit because they believed in me when I had nothing and sacrificed for me. So we need everything. You need the animal wranglers. I remember not, able to have a dog chase the character down because they brought a security dog. It was killing everyone apart from the person who brought it, So we don't have that. We don't have the animal wranglers. And the animal wranglers will not exist if you do a film after every, 4 years.
Yeah.
There needs to be a consistency in this. So goodwill from government is everything.
Speaking of government, let's throw this one to you now. Do African governments actually understand culture as infrastructure, or are they still treating it like entertainment? Yeah.
Well, no and yes. So do they understand? No. And I don't think it's all of them, because I do think that it's different things as well, because our art especially, and the idea of art as reflects culture is so diverse. You have music, you have art. So you find in different places, there's different things that are carried a different way. Like music in Tanzania, is not film in Tanzania, right? So it's a very interesting. Even now, music in Kenya is not film and TV in Kenya.
Absolutely.
They now occupy a different space. So I think that, and a lot of the time I actually say we could learn from musicians in Kenya. There's something to be said for different things, which in a way you'll find me doing something I rarely do, which is defend the government. One of the things that I have learned just going and listening to people on the other side, like even when you're talking to an investor and you're asking them to invest in you,
right? And
you realize, okay, if I was sitting here and I had to give out this money, it's like, what is the value that I'm getting back? Right? And the value isn't always monetary, but the idea of being able to express that value, I think even for a lot of the time, as artists ourselves, we don't understand the value culturally. Like, we don't understand our own value. Your musicians get it in an interesting way, and maybe it's because it's more obvious. But with film and television, because there's so many things that are moving parts, and so it's like, what was the second part of the question? So they don't, but...
Yeah, so what I was asking is, what do they don't actually understand about infrastructure culture as an infrastructure?
Yeah.
And the aspect of treating it purely as entertainment and not...
Yes, exactly. So there is that, like in everything that I read, even this thing that just came out the other day when they were like, we're going to do this with the film industry and the TV industry. There's this thing they keep saying, and I get why they say it, because Africa is a very young continent in terms of people are very young. Not the continent is young, but people are very young. So there's always this thing about youth. But what I find about that is that it frames it as this thing that it's for young people, which is, it's entertainment.
I see what you mean, yeah.
And it's only for young people, which then like kind of just puts it in a silo where you don't have to think about it beyond a certain point. And it's kind of classed into this thing of how to get young people to be busy. It literally feels like, when you say extracurricular activity, for the young people. So that's, and then when they'll go and get serious jobs later, then they won't be doing this. Here's a mobile phone,
go on the street and shoot something.
Exactly. So I think in that way, they don't see what it could be. They have no understanding, like when you look at South Korea and what they've come to understand about what they have. There's that famous story that's told about how the Prime Minister had gone to the US and he went to Netflix first, rather than go see the president. And I'm like, because you understand the thing that is powerful, right? So there isn't that understanding, I think, even sometimes even in terms of money, because I think Nigeria, like you said, it's a game of numbers, but they have understood the potential. So you have now banks investing, and of course, when people start saying that, everything follows, because again, for the government, if you think about it, I'm like, okay, between you and the health sector and this, what is your value? Why must I now concern myself?
What is your priority as well, though?
What's your priority, right? So it really is, and it sometimes can be frustrating to say, but I would say it's really incumbent upon us to prove our value. Like you kind of have
There's a lot of hoops you're going to have to jump through.
there is. And so and for me, in fact, a lot of the time I don't even look at government because I'm like, you're going to look at the thing and you're always going to come to it. It's like the Safaricom thing. You come to it when, it's a
Suddenly,
thing.
yeah,
And then
now-
now here we are, right?
Like
So
our
I'm like,
ice skaters, ice skaters and our archers and our horse riders.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Because
okay.
you look at what's happened with athletics, because it's like you've come later, but you're like, yeah, because this thing is clearly valuable. And it's
Absolutely. I
clear-
mean, and now Kenya is really been literally known as a running place. I was going to come to that.
Yeah.
The athletes have really proven themselves that they are worth the government turning to look at them and see how to invest in infrastructure of some sort to support their work. So, so there is that part. You're absolutely right.
I don't think it's impossible, because one of the things I was going to say about what's missing is there is a sense of, I find when I interact with people from other countries, I was like, I don't think I hesitate to say it this way, but then it's the only way I can express it. I'm like, I feel like we have collective low self-esteem. It's so interesting, because I'm like, we are such an interesting country, but it's like we don't know. You know, I think even the internet has kind of helped us, where we're like, we didn't realize that we were.
It's false humility, actually.
Yeah.
It is false
And it's like
humility. Because Nigerians, they'll have nothing, and then they'll be like, when the guy was trying to say they can't speak English, they're like, we don't care.
We don't care.
Yeah.
Or like, so, people are clear about what they have. And I think that there's a sense where we truly don't express it because we don't know it.
Right. Okay.
And so we also don't come together, because beyond all the funding and things like that, what I find interesting, and it's a thing we used to talk about in music all the time, where we're like, why don't people do jam sessions? Why don't people do this? And also we don't come together a lot, because even with Hollywood, you'll always find, when you look at the origin stories of people, it was like, when Steven and George Lucas and what's that guy, Brian De Palma and all these guys were hanging out together and they had no money and blah, blah. There's always that thing of the coming together, because there's an understanding that we've got something.
Exactly.
And we can do something. So I find that that's a thing that lacks among us.
Something you said about space and places where, I'm sorry, it's just something that popped in my head just now.
Spaces, right.
Yes,
Right,
it's something that
good.
just popped in my head right now. The reason why I enjoyed movies so much, and the reason why I used to do a show called Night of the Movies, where you have clips from the movies, and then you have the soundtracks that play, and just the music that makes the movies. Fox Drive-In.
Right.
We used to go and at dinner time, get your plates, sit in the car, and let's go to the drive-in cinema. And when you just mentioned that, I was thinking, what happened to drive-in cinemas? And you just said they've all been turned into churches.
Right.
Which is rather unfortunate.
Yeah.
Anyway, I digress.
Or churches, or the space has been preoccupied by something that is
Parking
not.
lot.
But there's no more Fox, there's no more drive-ins.
Yes, and there's no more that gathering, and it's in those gathering
gathering
spaces.
is a kind of what you
gathering
create.
is very important. I just came from watching the Michael Jackson movie. I was like, and the whole cinema was quiet. I thought, oh my God, there's still room for this. It's the gathering, and there were long queues, and I think one of the successful things that, what's his name, the director, oh my God, that guy, I see him, anyhow, that he succeeded in is just taking us back to just
there's a lot
endearing moment.
There's a lot of people who complain Janet Jackson was not in it.
She refused to actually be featured in it.
She's my favorite artist.
It's been taken back to an innocent time, I think.
Absolutely. And people were reacting to that, just the innocence of it, to the idea that we sit together and we watch, no one on their phone, the gathering. And I always say humanity is built for gatherings. That's why
we are social creatures.
Right, we are. And so there's a future for filmmaking because of just that aspect.
Okay.
Which I think is a lot of what Africans have to offer, because I said the world has become very cynical, and I don't think we're that cynical. We've not yet gotten to where a lot of people have gotten.
Right.
And we were discussing this about the whole difference between the critics and the view of the audience. And I'd said this before, because so the day Michael Jackson died, my mom had traveled. She called me to ask if I was okay. So just to have an idea of how it was deep. But then I was trying to capture the explanation of why I think he has the impact he has. And, it's never been surpassed. And it's like, even if you have other people who come in your time that are like that, if you play a child, my brother was showing me a video of his son seeing Michael Jackson for the first time and just being like, what is this? It's like, the childlike thing. And I said, there's something I think that he captured, which was just that childlike expression, which is what artists tend to have to offer. A very sincere expression of being a human being, right? And that's what takes people back to their childlike selves. And I think that what the film did was that it didn't give in to cynicism.
Right.
It captured that childlike mentality. So then you have this difference between the critics and the audience, because the audience is responding, again, going back to the audience equation where we ignore audiences. The audience is saying yes, and the critics are saying no. Right.
Because the critics want to stick to a certain formula on how storytelling is done, while the audience are looking for a feeling, Just tell me a story. And you always saw that in school or in whatever gathering you go, the guy who's able to tell the story.
Yeah.
Yes, he doesn't have many things, but he knows how to drop the story, twist the story, and he captures, in family gatherings, you're always,
that guy.
The guy who makes you laugh till you're choking on your food, that's what filmmaking is. It's that storytelling.
And it's so right what you're saying about the shared storytelling, the shared feeling. Because I still remember that when I was in doing my A-levels, which actually IB, there was a lot of people who were not allowed to watch telenovelas. And there was this telenovela that had come, it was a period drama. And it was so novel at the time, right? Because it was so dramatic and so cinematic compared to the other ones, right? So these girls, especially Asians, are not allowed to watch. And so we would literally have, when the episode would air, the next day at lunch, there would be storytelling sessions.
Recap, right.
To tell them what had happened. And I was like, my gosh. And then came the reaction videos. It's interesting how it's we all have to sit here and we have to tell you, and then people are chiming in and being and then this part, and they're literally not saying this happened, but they're painting the pictures.
Right.
And, so, and it's there's a deliciousness about the fact that we are all sharing that experience.
Yes.
Right? And I don't think that goes away. I think it's just that people, if they don't find it, if it's not offered, they're
So we need to re-tap into that.
Yeah.
I want to look at cultural diplomacy.
Right.
Right. There's a difference between culture that travels and culture that is actually deployed. Right. So what would it mean to Kenya to move from producing creative work to using culture deliberately, right, as a form of international positioning?
People for embassies. Come and ask them this question. People for...
I mean, and those are such big words, but, I always say, like I've said, I think my realization in all my travels was that capital consumes culture. And so even if you walk in a mall right now, what are you going to see? The pizza place, the Italian place, the Chinese place. So as we are walking in, what are we? We are just deciding on what culture we're going to pick today to eat or spend our money on. It's the same thing in terms of packaging who we are. And, already, what can I say? A bit of the groundwork has been put. When we're talking about Maasai beads, when we're talking about the runners, these are things that already, as you touch on them, they engage the global interest, I mean, tennis becomes so huge. Have you seen how many people are doing vlogs on them going and running with the runners from the world? I am I don't even know if Eldoret is capitalizing on this thing. It's huge. It's a running city, literally branded like that to the world. So I don't think you have to really reinvent the tool. You just have to look into Kenya and see what are the things that are already sticking out about Kenya. When we engage in Swahili, we already have people saying, they want to make Swahili I mean, it's already actually been charted that Swahili is the main language for Africa. What about putting that in our a bit of that dialect in whatever you're shooting? How about putting this jollof and pilau rice? How about putting a bit of that? So some of those cultural things we're talking about have already been identified what they are. It's just you incorporating them in your story. And if you do, it travels because people are already familiar with it. The groundwork has already been set.
Okay.
That's what I think. It's just, and the universal themes, of course, which are universal everywhere: death, love, betrayal, those are just, it's common everywhere. Who hasn't been betrayed or brokenhearted,
So,
I don't know what they would, because I think it goes back again to value, right? If you they're very clear. If you have people who are working as attachés or whatever in other places, they do say, let's bring Eliud Kipchoge, let's bring this person. why aren't they saying, let's bring this artist or let's bring this,
Yeah.
Now they're saying, let's bring this musician.
Right.
But, they're not saying, let's bring this film or let's do this. So I think it's, first of all, awareness, because there is also a marketing angle to it. That like I said, we tend to function as a silo and we tend to market to each other.
Yes.
Rather than the out,
Yeah, there's a different word for it, but that's,
yes.
you know what I mean.
Yes, exactly. So it's very self-indulgent. And so there is an aspect of even people within the country not knowing things exist and not knowing things happen. And part of that is, I think, also understanding that product assessment. Like I said, if you make a shoe, you are going to do everything to make sure that people know that you've made a shoe, right? And you're not going to go to the people who make shoes. You're not going to go to the people who already know that you've made a shoe. So I think it's even that awareness of
preaching to the choir? No.
Yeah, stop preaching to the choir and kind of also understanding the value, but also understanding
but the choir knows you as...
Yes.
So you want to preach to the congregation,
to the congregation,
so that they can understand what you're trying to get at.
And also the language, right?
Okay,
that's using language, because it's the thing we always say when we're pitching stories. If you go to pitch a story to, like, in a festival, you'll probably use a very film language, like, the character and
That's
the blah, blah,
true.
blah. But then if you go to pitch to a bank, you're like, listen, so this number of people watched film last year, and this number of, so also with audiences, it's how we also say things, like, look at trailers. They're very like, ooh, and then they're not trying to tell you about what the filmmaker was thinking and the director's deep emotional journey. They're just like, he was a boy, she was a girl, and like that kind of thing. And so I think it's also understanding the language of speaking to the audience, and that means being tapped into them. And the audience in this case being those people who would deploy, who would deploy the culture.
Right.
What is the language they would respond to?
Okay.
How does this make you look good?
And to say that, I actually got the favor of my film screening in France because the Kenyan embassy in France took favor of my film and they collaborated with UNESCO Paris and they actually opened up a screening for me. So here we saw where a government body understood what film was, and because film is very
based on the language
France,
that you used.
Yes, based on the language, of course, that I used, that I was using my story not just to tell a story, but to rebrand how a nation was being perceived.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Let me ask this question. I know it's going to be a bit left field, but where do you draw the line between cultural diplomacy and propaganda?
Thin line.
So let me tell
So
you something.
thin.
Really?
If I wasn't doing this, guys, I just want you to know that I would be those people who are working in a political campaign.
Right.
But I think
I would like you to know this about me.
But for how much slack Africa has gotten in terms of being perceived as a war-torn, famine-driven Africa, I'm going to cross the line and brand Africa as great as it needs to be, just to pay back for all those years.
Okay.
That, for the big baby with a big belly and the fly, that kept falling everywhere.
And everyone's done it because, you look at even like, so it was very fascinating when I was in school and we were watching old Hollywood films. You're like, it was not like that.
That's true.
It was a desert with nothing, but they were like, look at the American dream. You look at even when the shift started happening with shows like whatever in the city. I don't know if I'm allowed.
Okay.
So then, like that was a very huge shift. And they literally created a whole brand of woman who did not exist.
Yep.
They branded New York in a way that didn't exist. It was kind of like we have just created
hyperrealism.
This is the city and this is how women of this age are living. It was not a thing, So I think it's, and that's the point. It's like as storytellers, you're taking something and you're using, like you say, hyperrealism to kind of reflect an image. And I think that, of course, there's a really thin edge. Now, what I would say is I don't know that it is in your favor as an artist to be doing it as like maybe attached to a certain political position necessarily.
True.
I think that's where now you can start saying, maybe I wouldn't do that. But in terms of like the country or like a culture or, like even if I was to make a film about Taitas, I'm like, you best believe everyone will be there glorious, looking a certain way. We will be in the mountains with the mist, it'll be like, what is that land? You will not see any, know. And I think there's something to that because I think also it's not that you're telling lies necessarily, but it's that art has this way of capturing beauty even where there's ugliness, right? So even tragic tales are told in this beautiful way. It's like, oh my goodness, if you told that story the same way, you're like, so this guy left her. He ghosted her, but it was like the great love, and then they could not see. You know what I mean? So it's kind of like there is that essence of almost extracting beautiful things.
Yeah,
I don't think that's a negative thing. I don't think it would be necessarily propaganda. I think it's just a way of seeing, a point of view.
Propaganda can swing both ways. I swear, because and I make a
Negative,
confession. I make a confession, and I'm ashamed of what I'm about to confess.
Let us sip our tea.
Like it's what you said about bellies and flies. For the longest time, obviously there was the USA, not USAID, Feed the World, the whole Michael Jackson, and Quincy Jones actually, the ones who came
Live
up
Aid,
with Live Aid, right? It was that because it was pulling money together for Ethiopia and the drought.
Africa.
So my perception of I was going to Addis at some point, I think it was just a holiday, and I remember thinking, my God, I'm going to this place where there's just deserts and people starving and skinny people and what have you. And I landed in Bole and I was like, my God, Nairobi could learn from this place. It was absolutely amazing. Beautiful food, wonderful ice cream parlors. I was like, wow,
hot babes.
But well, I was not going to say that. But the whole thing for me was that picture I had of starving Ethiopian children,
right?
And here I am with ice cream parlors and wonderful hotels and everything. So yeah, there is that aspect in terms of how that can actually
right. And I mean, the ancient cultures in Ethiopia. I mean, they have churches that were built underground. They cannot even understand where that technology came from. So when they were branding the kid who was dying from hunger, there was no chance of explaining the grandness of this place, and probably by poor governance or anything, now it has come to this. So I err in showing the greatness of Africa for this season.
Okay, so
I
now,
want to err in that direction.
And I think there's just something about like even the storytelling is always going to do that, because even speaking to the churches, and is like if you you think of the biblical books, right? And you think of when Queen Sheba visited. And it was like, she came with, I'm like, guys, I bet it was not that dramatic.
Probably not.
But it was like the caravans of the, so I think it's like, there's always that kind of like hyper, description. Even Mansa Musa, we still know he was very, very wealthy.
Yeah.
But we know, I don't
stretching
know,
it a bit.
Gold dust was showering everywhere.
Right, but he tipped economies,
Yeah.
and he tipped economies, and I'm just like, I said, by the time I was learning these things, I was like, I wish I knew these things when I was younger. I'm like, I'd be so great. Because I had, even till today, I'm still detoxing a lot of what you were saying. This low self-inferiority to come to the place of where I feel I am great, So it just tells you how storytelling is so powerful. If you keep telling people they're not intelligent, if you keep telling people, what you are alluding to, that creative intelligence is not intelligent, that is passing time.
Yeah.
So if you're a filmmaker, if you're a storyteller, if you're a musician, hizo ni zile kazi za, those are the jobs for people who haven't quite figured out that they're serious in life,
It's not a career like being a doctor.
And that's such a fallacy, because
that's what I'm saying. That's what's been drilled. You're not a doctor. You're not a lawyer.
You're not serious.
And
I can't tell you how many times, even now with all the achievements I have, I still have to navigate that space where people, as soon as you say what they do, they're like, just, hey, I don't think she's a serious babe.
They probably don't have the bandwidth to understand. I mean, it comes with also understanding and being exposed. So if you don't have the bandwidth to understand what a filmmaker actually does, you're going to default to, yes, you're a doctor. You cut people open. You're a lawyer. You defend criminals. Tell me I'm a filmmaker. Like, okay, so what does that exactly mean?
Because I think it's one of the things that you spoke about, tensions earlier, right? That you have to navigate. It's one of the things that I really have learned to love about storytelling, because it's true. If you don't storytell, people don't die. Like, essentially, they don't physically pass away, right? If you make a mistake as a doctor, someone dies, someone leaves society dies, there is that. But then at the same time, you're like, but we understand also people die, right? Like, people die in terms of in myth, their stories die, who they are dies, their souls die. So it's constantly that tension of saying, yes, it is true, I'm not saving lives, and I am aware. And it also helps, like when I'm on a film set, I'm like, guys, also, if that light collapses, no one dies. So can we all become, we also need to, there's something about it that is, you want to take it seriously, but not take yourself too seriously. You want it to be serious enough that you give of yourself to it, but you don't also want to be like, I want you to think of me the way you think of a doctor, because it's like, I'm not.
No,
I'm not saving your life. But I also need you to understand what intelligence, what it is that is being conveyed through this. It's kind of almost more in a sacred way. It's the idea of history, like even the curation of human being stories, and the idea of that this is important, because not even so much I'm important, but because you're important.
Yeah.
It's important to sit and think. And I think that there is an element of, when you're existing in an environment where there's so much else going on, you don't have the luxury to a certain extent of saying, let's sit and philosophize, and think about the importance of life and the meaning of life. Yeah. But it's also why we exist, because that's our job, to sit and be like, let us present to you
what
this
but
thing
it's
about
very
life.
important that it is an important, and I choose to think it actually saves your life. Because one of the reasons why Africa has been left out of the tables of all these global discussions and everything is because we have nothing to show of ourselves. When you now read that, what was this country, Mike? I think it was Mali, that had well-concreted walls before, when UK was dying with the plague and everything. That wasn't documented. It wasn't documented in a story that we knew about. What if we knew about it? Wouldn't the engineers now be flourishing more because that was captured in a story that has been told over and over again? And now when they're beginning to reinvent their architecture, they're not reinventing it now from what they're learning from engineering, but they're like, hey, our ancestors in the 18th century did this. So I think it's actually saving lives. And, when we're coming to this table, it's not trying to compare. It's just, what role do you play? What role does the doctor play? What role does the storyteller play? All these roles are important as they are. Not equal, but important.
Yeah.
So, and importance is what we're discussing here.
Okay.
I mean, that's what I'm saying. It's not to the body. It's like you may not drop dead, but it's like, what will happen to your soul? Even just like when you see what happens when people don't know, like when whatever happened when people have had slavery, even before there was the transatlantic slavery, just even with the route to Zanzibar, and when you find people who have no sense of where they came from, or you find those tribes in India who have no idea of where they came from, and how it clearly affects the person.
Impacts, absolutely.
Being. So it's that idea that there's a record, there's something about a human being that requires.
So that's the impact in terms of that aspect of deployment as well. So strategy sounds clean until you actually, when the rubber hits the road, right? That's when the work starts, right? So in projects like Country Queen and Second Family, what did you learn about the invisible infrastructure behind global competitive work?
Oh my gosh, I think Country Queen was such an education number, because it was my first time writing, and it happened again providentially. I had just had my son, so I couldn't go on set. I was like, I can't be on set until 12 midnight. So I ended up seeing this call out for a writer's workshop, which is what it was supposed to be. And then when we joined, it was they said, oh, it's a writer's room and we're going to write a show. And I'm like, oh, okay. But I was like, this is so exciting, because as an actor, it had been very frustrating. You're reading scripts and you're like, is this all there is? And you get very frustrated. And it was always made to seem like such a hidden science and mystery. Yeah. So what it did is it demystified the behind the scenes for me, because I had done theater at that point. I think it had been 20 years of doing theater, of doing screen, of doing film and television, and always having this. It was a very secret world, because at that point the internet wasn't as pervasive as it is now. And I always tell people that I'm like, you guys can go on YouTube and do an entire film school on YouTube. Like you really should not be wasting time. But we didn't have that. So one of the things is that Country Queen really did that for me, because I did know people who had written on shows before that, but then not to this extent, and not with that kind of mentality of someone coming and saying, this is how we do it in our country. It was wonderful because it was meant to be a telenovela initially. And so they brought a telenovela consultant onto it. And he really made me a believer in everyone must do telenovelas as a beginning. No, and what was the education of that was the fact that when we were going through the history of telenovelas, which started off in Brazil, it was a way for books to be delivered to the public, right? So that idea that even that the innovation of all books were for the aristocrats and people couldn't access them, and then they started publishing them in the newspaper, and then they were like, when now, of course, the cinema had developed, they're like, how do we take this and actually take, they still even do the chapters now with the Capitulo, and they were like, how do we take this and put it on screen? And for me, it was that, like, also understanding that this is all always driven towards how can I get this to more people? How can I democratize, this thing? Because it's like, why should only one person have access to knowledge or have access to story? So the importance of that. And then also just like learning about the history of that idea in Brazil was learning how deep literature was for them and storytelling, and especially in terms of curating their history.
Right.
And so understanding why they felt a need for it to be out there to everyone, and why they're always discussing social issues. It was always about like, how our family is operating, how the society is. That's why it's like rich, poor. Theirs were very like, they're very similar to African culture actually, because there was a lot of the supernatural, a lot of this ethereal stuff going on. So they recorded a lot of their history that way. And that was one. And I was like, this is such a like good way to do it. It's very entertaining, but at the same time, you're like, I see it's born of something very deep. And so working in the writer's room, casting it, was also such a great opportunity, because I had always had a theory that I'm like, Kenyan actors are so brilliant, but the material that we get is a struggle. And so it was an opportunity to prove that point. And I think it was proven, because it was kind of like when we did the casting session and I was like, people, we don't train, we don't have training schools. People are not going to audition the same way, right? So like even running the auditions in a very different way and sticking to my guns about we're going to workshop it because people respond differently to a director. Then, so just even that thing of understanding how to bring your own voice to something and say, I think this is the way we should do this thing. And then with Second Family, again, I was called in as a writer. We did the first half as writers, and then due to many interesting circumstances, they called on me to do the show running. And it was also an experience because, again, demystifying production, right? Because even producing was always this mystery. What happens when you go to those corridors of Showmax, and just capturing that. And I from that, I really learned the lesson. And I always tell people, listen, filmmaking or rather television is simple. It's not easy, but it's simple. Do not think that you have to do so much. It's literally just following. Like, you want to tell a story, tell it like this. Make sure this is done and this is done and this is done. If you can do logistics, it's going to be done. If everyone just does their job, if you are committed to doing your part, because and I think that's where doing musicals comes back, because constantly being used to so many moving parts.
Absolutely.
The orchestra. It's so collaborative. And even understanding how those pieces would come together, because the magic of musicals was always when everything came together and you're like, wow, the song and the music, and so even with this, it was like getting to the point, because a lot of people kind of had lost faith, especially with the long running shows. And I was like, if you just do this and you just do this, I promise you, this thing there'll be magic. There'll be magic.
And that's leadership.
So Jinna, I want to come back to you. Your work, especially on Leo,
right?
Repositions rather, how African stories are actually being seen.
Right.
What is the strategic value of telling these stories in a different kind of way?
What's the strategic word?
What is the strategic value in terms of, rather than going through the usual, okay, fine, this is how we've always been told, when you now flip the script,
right?
Excuse the pun. When you flip the script and you look at it from a strategic, in terms of saying, okay, fine, I feel like telling this story in a different way, because the perception of Africans is, I
mean, I was young then, and I had spent, so many years in the US, and I got just so tired of all these stereotyped questions that they kept asking me. And I think Leo was my, what I was just trying to do was say something back about that, that we are intelligent people, that, we don't just have, we have problems like every other country, but this is kind of how we overcome them. That the children in Africa are not just dreaming for basic things, food, shelter, and clothing. Majority of them have that, but they aspire for higher things. They aspire to be superheroes. You know what I'm saying? They aspire to be astronauts. And that's what I wanted. I wanted to make a platform where an African child could believe that they could be anything. And especially it was also a call to affirm creative intelligence, which I feel lacked so much in the 844 system.
Right.
That we're constantly, thrown at the back. You're not the smart people, And so it was just my fight back to say these creative people are actually, it's just intelligence showing itself off in another way.
Okay.
Yeah, so I don't know whether that answers your highly sophisticated question.
And even the people in the refugee camps are also dreaming of more things.
Right.
Even when people are struggling, they're not just like, when is my next, they're also dreaming of things.
They're dreaming of bigger things. And this especially is a call to the people who advocate for policies or who are negotiating governments and stuff to understand that the average or citizen aspires for more. And, and understanding that responsibility, then you make the policy that helps this last. Make the policy that makes the exhibition spaces last. If there's money funded, given out to build these social halls. Remember there were social halls in the 90s in every estate. There was a social hall. It was for a reason. Then we had boxes. Then we had, the arts really thrived. Then we had better actors, the Mahakamani people, they were coming through those pipelines, So now if you think, even now when she's talking about casting, why you're not able to have very strong actors as you need them to be, is because there are schools for acting in Kenya that are really genuine schools.
Speaking of acting now, I want to ask this question because we've seen, I think, and this is not to take away anything from any Kenyan talent, any African talent. We've got your Lupita Nyong'os who are and people who've shown up in Superman, the new Superman. You've got Star Wars as well. By the way, there was a Kikuyu line in Star Wars, the very first one. Not many people.
I'm not a Star Wars fan,
but
I give it up to you. So, it's a huge movement, my God.
But it was, this was, back when the first Star Wars came out. But Africa is no longer invisible from that perspective, right? The real question now is who captures the value of that visibility? So it's basically asking this simple question. Are we at risk of exporting talent? Now you're talking about actors and what have you, right? While importing ownership.
Yes.
Absolutely. We have to build our systems. I just saw panel 54. I said the future of Africa is build your own systems. Build your own systems.
And I think it's a thing that people sometimes feel, you're being too protectionist. And I'm like, well, you have to be because, like you said, it's such a young industry. And I'm like, I don't know that we're equipped because I'm like, no, when people are coming, they're coming for a reason.
Yeah.
Right. And it's good.
What is it that they're saying that you are not seeing?
Yes. And the reason is good because it's like they see the value and that's something we should learn from you. Like, let me figure out what you see, that I don't see. But at the same time, you're like, if I am not equipped to fight back if you decide to do this and capture everything. Because we've not even built our own thing yet. And so you're in danger of, and the issue with that is not just in terms of the work itself, in like jobs, but it's in terms of the culture itself. Because then, is it really, like Kenyan? Is it really Ugandan? Is it really East African? In that case, it's like, because you'll always see it when it's through someone's eyes. You can always tell. It's like, this is not really, so it's now the challenge, I think, has become how to balance those things. Like, it's wonderful that, like if you think about the runners, that already happened. The infrastructure was there for years. So when you have these coaches, this, people, sponsors, whatever, coming in, they're coming in, but these people are solid. Eten existed, all these things existed. So you're coming into an ecosystem where it's like we benefit without handing you over everything. Right. Okay. But now for us, I think there's still that thing of like, how much do you just give away and how much do you, because is it even going to be yours anymore?
Exactly.
Right. I mean, the copyright is taken,
And that's what I want to actually ask you.
Right.
On that same question. So what does a fair deal between Africa and the global platforms actually look like?
Man, I just think it's first understand that we are equal partners in this, and it never comes at that play. You're always subjected to And now you start sounding like a freedom fighter. But there are all those undertones of you're lesser than. And it's because of those years of storytelling that had gone so wrong of what the value of an African is, that when you stand in that table, they're like, no, buy my art at deep level. And they are like, oh, no, but you don't have numbers. But now, of course, and that's why I really love your logo, 54. You're talking about we are reaching 1 billion people. I'm standing not just as Jinna as a Kenyan, but I'm standing Jinna. I'm going to embrace that identity, but I'm also going to be East African and I'm going to be African. So when I'm standing and I'm saying that I have access to 1 billion plus people. And I think when you're able to really understand what your value is, then you're really able to begin negotiating better.
Yeah.
And of course, it's not going to be now when you go that probably they're going to receive you at that, but at least you understand what it is to move what they have given you so that you can counter, negotiate what they've given you. So it's understanding your value. And then, of course, at the end, we must build our own systems. Because if you don't build your own system, the person who builds the system dictates the terms. And the terms will always be in their favor.
As it should be, because it's like if I built a thing, I'm like, you play by my rules.
I mean, it's really unfair at some point,
Like, you play by my rules.
Yeah, but if you're going to buy
take your toys away.
If you're going to buy me at a place where I cannot even invest back in the art, that means
make sense.
Right. And as so long as film or TV does not return money back, you have no business. It's just a passionate.
It's a passion.
It's a
passionate hobby.
It's an expensive passion.
It's very expensive.
and I think the other thing about it is, I don't know, there's something about like, you talk about the ecosystems that support all that stuff, right? And it's everything, including legal.
Yeah.
So like one of the things I was saying is it's very hard. I know that they exist. I know quite a few of them. But even just the idea of entertainment law, what's the copyright law, that ecosystem. Because I'm like, you go to Hollywood and it's like agents, lawyers, managers. There's a whole other
things
thing.
People don't actually understand, like you're saying.
Yeah.
People don't actually understand that saying. And this comes back to, I'm a filmmaker. In the legal, from a lawyer perspective, and you keep bringing this up, doctors, they all have that system already in place. In terms of somebody, unfortunately, dies on an operating table, you have legal backup in terms of indemnities and things like that.
Right.
But nobody knows. And unfortunately, I know. But then what I'm saying is people don't know there's aspects of legal systems, there's aspects of copyright protection.
Yeah.
Copyright, first of all, is one of the things that people probably do not understand. Whether you're coming into the industry or not, but even from the outside looking in, they're like, this is the end product. This is what I'm seeing. They don't know the whole swan on a lake, gliding very nicely. Underneath, people don't actually know what is going on.
You only find out about it when something happens.
Yeah.
Like that's when you're like, I didn't even know it was this easy to do this thing. I didn't know it was so easy to copyright, my script. I didn't know it was actually so easy to go and fill this claim. And just the fact that I have this thing, it's always going to go in your favor. Like it's like, because and that I think now speaks not just to art, but I think it now goes to the identity of political identity. So it's like the thing we always say where there's this understanding or belief, if I call the police, they won't come. Right? And the first time you have to call the police, it's always shocking when they show up. The same thing I think even when it comes to legal, right? This idea that, well, contracts won't matter. Because there's this idea about our legal system, blah, blah, blah. So you have to actually find out that this person went to court and then this happened and this judgment was made and everyone is shocked because it's like, really? It worked in their favor? That awareness amongst ourselves doesn't exist. Yeah.
So the next phase of cultural power is not just necessarily storytelling. We need to have ownership.
Absolutely,
right?
Yes.
So whoever wants to take this question first, we look 20 years ahead. Can Africa move from being a producer of culture to an owner of cultural infrastructure?
Yes. Why not?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I don't think it'll happen through politicians. I think it'll happen through the creators.
It would have to be.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think it'll not just happen through the creators only. It's that cross-cultural collaboration. I am a firm believer, open up the borders. Let these cultures integrate. Because one of the reasons why Nairobi is such a brilliant city is because it's a melting point of so many cultures.
Okay.
When you allow that, innovation thrives. When we allow that borders for people to flow, then there begins to be that whole idea of we are one unit. And in that, a lot of innovation will thrive to the problems that we see.
Okay.
And of course, the idea that everyone is going to move is a lie. Like how many people have moved from your shanks?
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
The what do you call them? The innovators will move. Not everyone's going to
exactly.
move. So that fear of that, I think, is, it's just a fear that has been put.
Yeah.
And I understood the importance of that because during COVID, I remember Gates was being interviewed and he was like, I think New York was the hotspot for COVID. And he said, no, they will not shut down the borders. They cannot shut down the borders within America. They cannot.
I want to ask about a very...
Just if you want to see the importance of greatness within a nation, that is one of them. Yeah.
Dirty letter, dirty word, AI. Where does AI actually expand opportunity and where does it threaten authorship and labor actually?
Actually labor.
So I'm such a tech junkie, so I try everything. And so I've seen so one of the things is that I stopped feeling afraid, especially when it comes to writing. But people should feel afraid because the more you use it, the more you teach it.
Yeah.
You're kind of teaching it how to figure it out. But where it is right now, it's like even when you do when the people who've done, we're just doing something the other day where I can tell the script is AI, you can tell,
right.
And there's a deep lack of humanity in the thing. But you know what I also find about AI, when you look at it and what it does, especially when it comes to things like writing and creation, in quotes, it is due to homogenization that happened in the US. I was like, again, going back to you put your own nail in the coffin, right? The minute you started saying, all movies are like this.
Right.
Well, now AI knows how to write a Marvel movie, right? It knows how to write a rom-com because this is the formula, because you said there was a formula. And we were just rewatching stuff from the 90s the other day, and we were like, the same year there was Fatal Attraction, there was this other random action movie. And the movies were so different.
The bandwidth was
and right now it's like you will have 5 years of action. Then you will have 3 years of rom-com. That's
when you start creating cinematic. When you start creating cinematic universes, then you're going to carry it. Well, you know which one I'm talking about.
And I think actions is what is killing cinema.
And you look at what action was back in the day. You're like, it's gonna be this one, and then it's gonna be different with this other side. But if you look at and even rom-coms, it was like it will be When Harry Met Sally, but it'll also be Pretty Woman. And it's all like there's that human take. So
there's a divergence of some sort.
Anyway. So I said, I think with AI, what already happened is that the reason it can is because that's the formula, right? The minute it's almost like you have to steep yourself further in originality for that not to be an issue. Because it's like, well, the only reason it can do that is because you give it a formula and because the formula is the same.
It's going to just repeat the same thing.
So it can write you a hallmark. But it is frightening because it, of course, lands very fast, right? And the more you feed it, the more it learns. But when it comes to, and I can see how it helps, because if you're thinking of resources, to be very honest, writing rooms, right, for instance, or like the time thing I was talking about, when now the competition, in fact, especially in Kenya or in Africa, with this youth, you have to do output on television. So you're thinking, okay, I would take possibly 4 weeks to really think through, especially the beginning of an idea, and say, this is going to be what the thing is, this is going to be my synopsis, rather. Now you're like, if I go and type in all these thoughts and then say, generate this thing, it's going to do it in a second, right? And it's like, then it becomes a dicey thing of how much of that is you and how much of that is this thing.
Yeah.
Because as you've put that input in, you've also taught it certain things, right? But at the same time, you're like, I can see how people are going towards that, because you're like, I don't have the resources to get 10 people. I don't have the resources to go through, 10, this number of people, or I don't have the access, right? I don't have the access to learn this thing. And there's a thing that knows, right? There's a thing that knows what to do. So it's such a dicey thing. But I think it helps, because one of the films that we did, I was doing a training program with the US Embassy where we're training 5 teams of young filmmakers. And things like one of the teams had done a film about space, and Kenya in space. And they had a lunar station with Kenya and the flag in space. And I was like, that's a cool use of AI, you know.
Right.
So there's like things which you're like, I can see how this is, because you're like, you would never have done this film otherwise, right? You'd never be able to do something that looks this good or this realistic because you just don't have the resources for it, right? So it's such an interesting conversation. But interestingly enough, I will say, I do not fear it in terms of, I do not think it can really co-opt.
Well, it can't do talent.
It can't do talent.
You know?
And even when...
it cannot do. Absolutely, it can.
can't.
And you only have to be talented to see, even if you feed your ideas, how it brings it out.
Yeah.
You can tell it's not
It sounds like a robot,
Yeah, it's very robotic about it, mechanical about it.
Yeah.
You know, the nuances of how a human creative mind thinks, it has not captured. I'm not saying it might, but it has not captured yet as where we are. I think for me, you know, it's like, you know, how, what do you call them? Those guys who used to do shorthand. The importance they were, and then computers came. Remember, every company in the 90s had to have that secretary who could write that shorthand.
Yes.
It looked like some, you know, ancient language of some sort. And at some point when they were being told the computers were coming, these people were so important, no one would think that you could do away with them. But the computers came, and they added value or speed or whatever it is, you know. So I think there are good values to AI, but is it gonna wipe out the need of human talent and human connection? I don't think that it can, because these are things that make us human. If you don't long for gatherings, if you don't long for storytelling, you know what I'm saying? A part of you somewhat is not alive, you know.
Okay.
So I think there's hope, and I think also it's important that African governments put policies. You know, I think it was, I don't know what nation is it, China, where TikTok is only allowed because it's giving educational content back to its own citizens. But here in Kenya, it's like, we're just going to follow, free for all. And I'm like, no, analyze that thing. See, is it of use to our citizens? What policies can we put to protect our citizens?
Yeah.
So I think, you know, it's just having, of course, and it always goes back to, I like the people who really care about you. Because if they do, then they think through these things. They're just like, we're not going to just let this organization or this innovation or whatever run us over. We're going to see how is it beneficial to our citizens, and how can we really in turn make it be beneficial.
Okay, and I think, I'm going to bring it home. Sorry.
Bring it home.
Like I said,
we need to think.
No, fine. So this is going to go to both of you, and just very quickly, just look at this and let me know your thoughts, right? If culture is going to become part of Africa's global influence strategy, right? Who actually needs to be at the table?
I do think especially artists need to be at the table.
I was just about
because
to say that
that is one of the things, even with these conversations on politics, has been really irks me, because it's like there's always everyone but a creator. Because to your point, there's no acknowledgement of what creative intelligence is. You know?
If I want your opinion, I'll give it to you kind of situation.
And yeah, you know, this is what the creators need, and you're sitting there as the creators being like, I don't know that that's what we need. But, you know, so I think that in itself, the recognition that, because like I keep saying, and this sounds very grand, but it is like a sacred thing. There was a reason. The storytellers will tell you, they don't know how they do what they do. You don't know why you think the thought you think. It's almost like an instinct that comes to your mind. And they're understanding the value of that. Like, this is almost like the way you would be like, that person saw the future and they told us that this is how it could go. And understanding that that's the value, right? So you need people who read people, because that's essentially what do is you understand human beings.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think those people should be at the table to say, this is what I think people wish or desire, or how people see things.
Okay.
Yeah.
Jinna, take it on.
Governments have to be at the table.
I was going to say that would probably be the most obvious one, but okay.
Right. They do have to be at the table, and they have to be more open-minded to understanding what creative intelligence is and how it's working for them or how it's working against them. The only problem of what we have seen with a lot of African governments is as soon as you touch the creative freedom, then it's like, oh my God, these people are going to really work against us. You know what I'm saying? But that's not the thing, you know. So it's like we can allow the doctors to have freedom, we can allow the educators, we can allow the scientists to do what we need. But these people who've really, what do you call them? They ran on the fuel of freedom of expression. We're going to see how we can cap them and suppress them, you see. So I think government should be on the table, and everyone else, you know, there are all those other, I think there are like 6 items that are not.
I was wondering, what about, and this is just my thought, then we close, institutions like museums,
Absolutely.
schools. We can bring in the doctors and lawyers as well. But yeah, I think there's that aspect as well in terms of that culture that is built from the ground up. Might be something some other people want to come to the table, perhaps.
Especially historical societies, to your point, because I think the idea of culture, history, and storytelling is so intertwined. Even the things that we don't know to tell stories about, you know.
Yeah, okay.
So yeah, that would be a definite one.
Ladies, thank you again. Thank you so much for joining us on Panel
thank
54. We'd
you.
like to have this conversation. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for now. At the core of this conversation is a shift in perspective. Culture is not peripheral to power. It shapes how countries are understood before they are even engaged, and how identities travel long before policy ever arrives. Africa is not absent from the global cultural conversation. That phase is already over. The question now is different. Who frames the stories? Who benefits from them? And who owns the systems through which they move? There is a difference between visibility and power. And without ownership, visibility can very quickly become exposure. In the end, the question is not whether Africa can tell its stories, it's whether it can own the terms of which those stories are told. So if culture is going to take its place as part of Africa's global influence strategy, then the work ahead is not just creative, it is structural, it is economic. It's about building the capacity not just to tell stories, but to hold them. You've been listening to Panel 54, where we rethink the world one African perspective at a time. If it made you pause, reflect, or reframe, share it, start a conversation, and tag us in. Find us on our social media handles at Panel54Pod and your favorite streaming platform. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, and remember, keep the lens clear. Panel 54, the global perspective through an African lens.